why I did Requiem for the Living, why I created this. The one was because I was rather disappointed in a previous production which was not recorded effectively. It was a musical I had written for children at the National Art School, and when I received the recording there was virtually nothing on it. And so I was very, very miserable after preparing that for many years. So my doctoral supervisor, or the person who became my doctoral supervisor at that stage, invited me to do a PhD, or a DMUS in those days, in composition. And she said, all right, so use your musical that you wrote, and what else are you going to write? Make it count for something. So I said, you know, the way I feel now, I'm going to write a Requiem. But at about the same time, there was in the news a lot about the AIDS orphans. And it felt to me in some of my middle of the night awakenings that children everywhere in Africa were calling for help. And that doesn't mean that I was a lunatic, it just meant that I was affected by the information that I heard, that children as young as 5, 6, 7 years old would be without parents possibly, or without anyone to help them in life at all. And my son was 3 or 4. And I just realized how helpless and vulnerable children are, and they cannot make it without adult help. So I started to think about this theme. And my mother, I think at the time, said, Rexley, you know, negative things happen, all right? But you can turn them into something positive. You can decide to turn this around for yourself. The fact that you didn't have a recording or whatever, and you can turn it around, perhaps you can turn it around for the children as well. Create something positive. And that's what my parents were always like. They were creating something out of nothing most of my life. And creating positive out of negative. So I went back to my doctoral supervisor and I said, I'm going to write a Requiem, but it will be a Requiem for the living, the ones who are left behind. In Requiem for the Living, I think Slava Richter, who was a piano teacher at the school where I teach voice and violin, was an artist as well as a piano teacher. And she had come from Russia to this country and settled here and made it her life project, really, to help children to play the piano. But she was also a painter, and in the Soviet Union she used to paint with old makeup from the movies. Face paint and lipstick and anything that was left over. Quite an extraordinary woman. And she then showed me some of her paintings, which were based on the writings of Credo Mutwa. And so from that, Slava said that I could use her paintings if I wanted to, because we spoke about Requiem for the Living. She allowed me the use of these. And then Slava got liver cancer. This took several years, obviously. I was writing the Requiem, talking to interested people, creating the words, and she died of liver cancer, very suddenly actually, just as she was about to retire. And so her husband has allowed me the use of the works, if I want to use them. And they are on the Requiem for the Living website as part of the history. And the connection, of course, because Credo Mutwa has got some very strong views about children and AIDS and health. I came to this because it was a personal journey. And I think as a musician, I had already been exposed to quite a large range of music growing up and studying. And because our country is so diverse, hearing it on the radio. And so when I came to write it, I first went on some of the themes that I wanted to explore through the lyrics. And I created those partly as I went along, and I also looked at the Requiem prayer, which is really originally a prayer for the dead. So I looked at that to see whether there were any texts there which I could then use in Requiem for the Living. And then I selected one or two and I started work on the composition. The cultural diversity in Requiem for the Living, as I created it, it started off because the history of requiems they are prayers for the dead in churches, and they were for centuries. And then they passed into bigger compositions by famous composers like Mozart, for instance, and Verdi, and they actually became enormous concert works. So they were taken out of the exclusively church environment into the concert area, performance area. And they've been written by many different composers of different backgrounds, and quite often on a Latin text. So that was then an ancient language. But I saw no reason why not to include, like Brahms did, German. He wrote Deutsche Requiem, the German Requiem. And then there are others. There are French ones. Fauré has written a Requiem. Duruflé has written another Requiem. There are many, many people that have written using either Latin or German or French or a combination of texts. So, and some of the church prayers go back, of course, to Greek history. So there are Greek prayers as well. And as I went along and I realized I would like to include some of the Psalms in one of the movements, I then started touching on the Hebrew history because the Psalms were originally Hebrew. So I thought, well, those are some of them ancient languages, and why not include English and Afrikaans and any of our indigenous languages? I went along and my fantasy took hold of the composition and of the creative process. I just introduced the languages that I knew from my background and the languages that we have here and put them together because they all are present in our country. There are many different cultures here, including the indigenous ones. There are also Portuguese. There are many Indians in this country. There are Chinese, and they've been here for a long time. They're part of our cultural diversity. They're part of our life experience. It's an incredible melting pot of different cultural backgrounds. So I started to include them either in little texts or culminating in two large movements in Requiem for the Living, in the Sanctus 1 and 2, which is effectively a text which means holy, 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 Lord God of hosts, however you conceive the divine. And these are praises, little praise texts, either from the Psalms or from the Buddhist tradition, in one case with the Chinese girl, and from the Indian Vedic chant by the Indian lady who participated. They were all part of creation, really, praising the Creator. And in the instrumentation then I brought in, in the strings, I actually arranged this as a quela. There is, in fact, also an African flute involved in here, and the player is playing a kind of quela-ish sort of rhythm on that of the strings. And then the other instruments in many cases were the insects or the animals of creation, interjecting here and there in between the human beings. That Requiem for the Living was always intended to bring together some rather diverse groups of people. And in the process of putting the musicians together, we had a professional ad hoc orchestra that I brought together specifically for this production, with a Dutch conductor, a young man who came specially out from the Netherlands to conduct, And we also had two very different choirs, Gauteng Opera Chorus, who are people perhaps from less privileged backgrounds who now have the opportunity to sing because they have wonderful voices in Gauteng Opera, which is a project. And then we had the Horizons Project Choir from Pretoria, very different kind of choir, young professionals in other professions who come together to sing. And they sing a lot of rather difficult, newly composed Eastern European, South African and other cultural music, unaccompanied. So very different to an opera choir or opera chorus. And we also had a children's choir from Pretoria who participated in one movement, the DS Irae, from an Afrikaans school. We had the Music Enlightenment Project that I brought in by bus to play in the foyer to the patrons before the production, and they are children from Braamfontein, underprivileged children who are part of a project where they learn orchestral instruments and other instruments. There were Nigerians involved. The Music Enlightenment Project is run by a young Nigerian who lives in this country. And also the call singer was from Nigeria, but he was studying at the University of Port Elizabeth. I had several girls from Rodin School, which is a private school, and they come from all different backgrounds in languages and cultures. German, French, Sesotho, Setswana, Portuguese, two boys from the Randburg Afrikaans school, and those were my son in English and another young man in Afrikaans. And not only that, of course, but we had the other soloists involved. There was a boy soprano from another private school. And many of these people would very likely never have met if it was not for this production. I've also taken this on a Jungian sort of path because of my own life journey. Jung was an extraordinary psychologist who looked deeply into the human psyche in terms of what he described as archetypes, which are sort of organs of the psyche, if you like. And they describe how our psychic functioning is something that we're actually born with. And we seem to come into the world with these images or the ability to recognize them and to gain value from the symbolic notions, if you like, of these archetypes. And so in Requiem for the Living, I've explored some of these, ranging from disintegration at the one end of the psyche, if you like, and through to integration at the other end. The images that we created, and that Marlene van der Merwe created with her photography, were taken from some of the main themes which I isolated from the work. So the texts were perhaps referring to liberation, for instance, right at the beginning, liberation from our own limitations as human beings. And so I had a first image of a man throwing off a chain, and there's a reflection in water. And the symbology is to do with the casting off of the chains of our past, which we don't need anymore, or turning away from disintegration of the psyche and turning towards health and integration. Bells have been used to call people for centuries. And not only that, in wartime they were melted down into cannon. And then in peacetime they were melted down and made back into bells. So I used the bell symbology there to recognize an inner call to let go and to allow forgiveness in one's own life, or to choose forgiveness, as on the path towards integration. And the final picture of these four images is of the epiphany of integration, and that would be for me also connected to compassion as being perhaps one of the highest forms of wisdom. And so it's an angelic figure, and there are there's wing-like imagery with feathers, and a beautiful girl also involved in that picture, looking up into the camera. So doing that through the text and writing of the music of the Requiem for the Living enabled me to do that. And when I had finished writing it and I'd handed it in for my doctoral study, amazingly enough, after I had written the music, I then had a powerful dream in which I heard quite extraordinary harmonies, and ecstatic harmonies, in fact. So beautiful that I actually woke up and I thought, oh, shall I write that down? Is this part of the Requiem for the Living that I didn't write? And I had a kind of insight at that moment that this was, yes, part of Requiem for the Living as an ongoing life journey, because one never really arrives. You only perhaps get to your next phase. But I didn't need to write it down for Requiem for the Living. It was an indication, my psyche telling me quite clearly that I was back in harmony and that I had reintegrated. And I no longer had the problems with depression that I had had in the past. So it was like a self-medicine, if you like, self-healing.